Welcome back to the Banderpod, the illustrative and illuminating podcast of Bandersnatch Books. We're a small press publisher of treasures found off the beaten path for lovers of all that is good, true, and beautiful. I'm Annie Beth Donahue, and today I'm talking with Matthew Mellema about the developmental editing process and how a lifelong fascination with dinosaurs led to a novel series. Matt, welcome to the Banderpod.
Thank you so much for having me. This is kind of weird. It's like the first we met because I invited you onto my podcast, and now you've invited me onto yours, and the circle is complete.
That's right. That's right. Thank you. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump into this because I think that you, like me, are a plotter, not a pantser. So tell me about your developmental process.
I am 100% on Team Plotter.
High five.
So yeah, exactly. We're an exclusive club, but that means I outline everything before I write it. This book that I wrote, I had to outline it before I go. I'm one of those people where I just can't sit down with a blank page with no plan. First drafts are hard enough for me to write anyway, but not having a plan is just terrifying. I always try to make sure I know exactly where I'm going before I get going. So I'll have each chapter kind of outlined. Maybe I'll have a few passages sort of written. It gets to be a very detailed outline, but I need it. I need it. It's my protective crutch, my teddy bear.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I hate to tell people this if they're not a plotter, but as the developmental editor, I can tell. I can tell when somebody is and when they're not. And, it's okay if you're not a plotter and then you take your work to an editor that can help you get it into shape. That's totally fine. I understand people work in different ways. But as a developmental editor, it's something that I pick up on as I'm reading through the chapters, as I'm looking at the entire structure of the story. I'm big on story structure. And so I look for particular things within a story like, oh, is there a character turning point? Is there, kind of like this rough 3-act sort of structure to the story. And when there's not, then that just means that sometimes there's more work to do.
No, exactly. And yes, to be clear for our many pantser friends who are probably listening to this, you can write really great books the pantser method. It's just you have to be very comfortable, one, just sort of letting yourself go, seeing where you wander, and two, knowing that you're going to have to come back to your first draft and do a lot of revisions on it on the back end. Yeah.
Exactly. I think some people have a really good gut feeling about story structure. So they just kind of like, they just know in their gut how this should go. And that's totally fine. But there really is like a science and a method to what makes a story compelling to a reader. And some of that is very, very old. This goes way back to like how our brains work. You know what I'm saying?
No, absolutely. So there's, different schools of thought on like story structure, right? And a lot of these, the folks who sort of put forth these theories will be able to trace them back, through Greek antiquity, back to Gilgamesh, all that stuff, right?
Right.
Some have a lot more validity than others, but the hero's journey is sort of the prototypical one, right? If you want a very clear example of the hero's journey, look at the first Star Wars, because George Lucas basically went paint by number, hero's journey, all the beats, right? So that's the sort of thing I like to keep in mind. I'm guessing you probably did the same thing when you started writing fiction, where before I got going, I read a few like books on like story structure and all this stuff. And generally they'd have the same beats, right? You'd have the main character, like a day in the life, then something happens, the inciting incident. That's a term me and you were bandying about in the in my draft, right?
Yeah.
You go to that, and then they sort of leave their world, they go to the new world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there's like these chapter marks that you have. I like that because it gives me a destination. It also helps me to sort of fill out the story, right? Because you are getting ready to start the story. You're like, okay, I need to open it with like a day in the life. Here's the ending. I need the inciting incident here. He needs to like go to this new world like a third of the way through. Then in the middle, and once you put that together, you realize you already have the skeleton of what you're going to do. And I find that very liberating because once I have the structure there, I can sort of run wild with all the rest of it.
Exactly. Because there's that overarching story structure and then there's also like a chapter structure as well. Because as you know, when you get to the end of the chapter, you want people to want to turn the page. and read the next one, right? So there's also some strategy to how you set up your chapter as well.
Yeah, so a lot of this same structure that works at the macro level for the whole story, you kind of make in a micro level for the chapter, right? Because to take an example, there's always something that the protagonist needs to want, right? There
Mhm.
has to be some goal that they're doing. Maybe, in regards to the whole story, it's to like save the kingdom from the bad guy or whatever. But in this particular chapter, maybe it's escape this dangerous situation, or it could be find someone to talk to at this new school that they're going to, right? It can be this sort of thing, and that's what drives the tension, drives the plot going forward at a chapter level, and hopefully that keeps the reader going each piece through chapter by chapter, so eventually they'll be hooked on the macro level as well.
Yeah, 100%. Each chapter also has to have that same structure, and it keeps it like dominoes falling forward until they click, 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 click all the way to the end of the book.
Yeah, exactly. It also saves you from accidentally writing one of those chapters that we all skip, right? Where it's the chapter where it's like it's a lot of exposition, it's a lot of, world building all at once, or it's like this little scene that doesn't really do anything to advance the plot, but the author really likes. I think most authors, I'm very prone to write those scenes. So just having that in the back of my head, it's like, okay, what does my character want here? What is the problem that he's trying to solve? How do I move the plot forward? It keeps me from accidentally laying some quicksand for the readers as they're trying to get through the book.
Yeah. So speaking of your writing,
I thought you were going to say, speaking of quicksand. I was like, oh man, cool transition.
speaking of quicksand, since we lived through the 80s, right? That was a thing back then. Everyone was falling in quicksand. So speaking of your writing, what were your thoughts on maybe one of the changes that I suggested when we were doing your editing?
Yeah, so probably the change suggestion that you gave that I spent the most time sort of puzzling through was on the first chapter. Because the first chapter, it's super important, obviously. I think I probably spent more time on chapter one of my book than any other 10 chapters put together, right? Because it needs to,
As you should.
yeah, exactly, it needs to do a lot of things. It needs to hook the reader's attention, it needs to set the scene for the world, it needs to get the action going, and significantly you need to make sure that the audience builds some sort of affection, a rooting interest in the protagonist.
Right.
Doesn't necessarily mean the protagonist is a good guy or like this perfect person, but the audience should sympathize with them, kind of root for him at some level, right? That is very difficult in a lot of stories because a lot of protagonists are supposed to go through a character arc, right?
Right.
So they start at one place, then they build, they grow, they mature, they get to a better place at the end. So that means they have to start off with all these
Mm-hmm.
flaws. So my main character's flaw, or at least one of them, is that he was very self-centered and basically he's just sort of looking out for his own stuff, which, I think that's a perfectly fine character arc to go through.
Especially for someone of that age, because this is a book about young people, right?
Exactly, exactly. But that also means that my character was kind of a selfish little jerk at the beginning, right? And you pointed out it was hard to really sympathize with him in chapter one with that in mind. So it's like, okay, how do I help this kid be relatable to an audience right away without it seeming tacked on and without it undermining the character arc?
Right.
So that was really tough. What I ended up doing was a variation of the pet the dog technique. Are you familiar with
Mm-hmm.
that particular term? I think we
Yes.
talked about that. Yeah, so basically it means that you let the main character do something kind of nice to like they might pet the dog literally. So what I did is my character, as so many characters are, is a stegosaurus herder, right? He watches over a herd of stegosaurs. So I had one stegosaurus go off into the wilderness and get lost, and my character goes off and finds him and gives him a little pat on the snout, pet the stegosaurus, gives him an apple before going back. So it was like, okay, this kid may be kind of a selfish jerk in some ways, but hey, he's nice to a stegosaurus. He likes him, he'll go after him. So that's something that I hope will help the audience relate to him.
Yeah, it's those little tiny glimpses of our humanity that allow us to relate with the main character. I would pet the stegosaurus, right? Like I would pet the dog. So now I can relate to to this person think they can't be all that
Exactly,
bad because if they
exactly. And
did something I
it
would
gave me a
do.
chance to describe what the beak of a stegosaurus feels like. So that's good too. You know, it was a win all the way around.
Yeah, that's helpful. All right. Do you have any tips that you could share, resources that you use for developmental editing?
You know, I don't have any particular titles, but there are a lot of very good resources on basic structure. So to that point, though, I think there's kind of a balancing act. On the one hand, I think some people just sort of dive in without any knowledge of plot structure, which is understandable, not the worst thing in the world, but it could get you into trouble if you don't really know, again, like inciting incident, rising action, what the climax should be, all that sort of stuff. So I do think you need to at least do some homework on it. But then there's the opposite problem, which I found myself in for a while, where you do too much homework, where you read too many of these books by folks who give slightly different plot structure advice.
Mhm.
So then you're like, okay, I kind of feel like I need to incorporate all of it. You cannot incorporate all of it. You need to just pick like one or two that you find particularly helpful and sort of stick with that. So that's one of the things. Don't lose the forest through the trees. Pick your one or two as sort of your guiding star. And then related to that, for those who are outline curious but skeptical, I think a lot of folks view outlining as kind of this cold, like mathematical thing. You know, like it's more like algebra formula than writing. But that has not been my experience at all. I find creating the outline to be a really creative process. For me, my favorite parts of writing a story are sort of the final polishing touches, you know, like your final pass through where it's like, okay, it's coming together. You're sort of really going through word choice and all that. So the very final stuff and the very beginning stuff when I'm coming up with the idea and coming up with the outline. Because you can just sort of let your imagination roam free within the guardrails of the outline. It's like, okay, will it be a really fun sort of middle act, adventure to do that can advance the plot in some way? Then you just sort of let your mind go crazy with it. Then I'll write down a few beats of the scene in my outline. So by the time my outline's done and I'm ready to start, it's essentially a very rough first draft, right? Where I have a lot of the stuff that I need. I try to capture some of the scenes, some of the mood, and then I feel like the rest of it just gets a lot easier from there.
So when you intentionally create structure around what you're doing, it forces you to actually become more creative because you have to figure out, how do I do my art within these boundaries? How do I do my art within this structure? And you actually end up with something more creative than if you had just, done whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's an example. Let's say I tell you, okay, you have 10 minutes to write a story, and that's all the guidance I give you. That's going to seem really daunting, and you're probably not going to be able to do it. But if I told you, okay, you have 10 minutes, write a story about a pigeon who runs for mayor of New York City, you'd probably be able to do it. And you'd probably be like, okay, I have ideas. And you start processing right away because I gave you some structure to send your creativity just flowing with it. So I think those rules can really help. So something else I've been doing, just sort of this little project I've been doing for my kids, is I've been writing them a series of like Advent letters, so like parts of a little story each Sunday of Advent for several years. And because I like structure, I was like, okay, each of these years is going to be built around a different one of the cardinal virtues. Okay. And that actually really helps the creative process, right? And once that gets going, it gets really easy. So the structure there, sort of giving myself this set theme, was actually a really useful thing in helping the creativity go.
So there is a G.K. Chesterton quote from Orthodoxy that says, "The artist loves his limitations. They constitute the thing he is doing. The painter is glad that the canvas is flat. The sculptor is glad that the clay is colorless." And that applies to writing as well. We do enjoy the fact that we have certain limitations.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the limitations that sort of propel the creativity in a lot of ways. Like, I really sincerely think that the limitations I put on myself are the things that make writing the books easier.
All right, so let's get to some personal questions. Matt, as a homeschool kid of the 90s, you were in a different world than the homeschoolers of today. What vivid memories do you have, and how do you think the experience helped or changed or influenced who you are today? And what was it like being a homeschool kid who then went to Yale Law?
So yeah, it is true that homeschooling in the 90s was very different than homeschooling now. I feel like homeschooling now has gone mainstream, but we were there before it was cool. So for me, homeschooling did a couple things for me in terms of shaping my writing, I think. One of them is it gave me, opportunity to kind of explore some quirky interests. I feel like a common thread from a lot of us homeschool kids is we all have at least several kind of quirky interests that we we have free reign to pursue as kids. Dinosaurs, writing stories, that sort of stuff. I did that all the time. Another thing is, and this is different, right? Because different people react differently. So I was homeschooled throughout most of elementary school and middle school. I went back to sort of a private school here in town for high school. Like my brothers did the same thing. They were fine, right? They slid back into the social scene, zero problems. I was one of those kids who was way too self-conscious though, so I kind of had in my head like, "Oh no, how do I interact with these kids who've been to regular school this whole time?" That got me a little bit socially awkward, which meant I became an observer, right? So I'm sitting there like observing this human contact, these humans interacting like, so that is how you talk to a girl. Okay, I'm not going to do it, but I'm glad I saw that guy do it. So I feel like that helped me just because to be a writer, you need to really observe a lot of stuff and process it. So that was very helpful for me. Then in terms of going to Yale Law School. So that part was very unusual too. So, by that time, obviously, I went to college, had a few years off in between. So that lots of life had happened. But what I found interesting is you always hear about being a homeschooler that you're in a bubble. And a lot of times that's true. It's not always true, but sometimes it's true. But what I noticed there is that a lot of those folks are in a bubble too, right? The sort of bubble of high achieving privilege that they may not realize they have. Their dad's a senator, their mom is like a professor at Stanford or whatever. So just like simple things like you eat at chain restaurants. When was the last time you ate at a Chili's or an Outback? I'm filling out like last week, and everybody else like, oh, what's an Outback? That sort of stuff. So just that perspective was very illuminating, especially seeing these clashes of bubbles.
Yeah, that's interesting. And right, it shows you that you can be in different kinds of bubbles.
Yes, there are lots of bubbles in our society, and it's some bubbles are better than others. But I think the key is if you're in a bubble to at least recognize you're in one, because the worst place you can be in is being so deep in a bubble you don't realize you're in a bubble anymore.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. All right. So we assume you graduated, right? And
I did, thank you.
you did. Great. So it worked out. And then you became a trial lawyer. So are there any overlaps in being a trial lawyer and an author?
Yes, I do think where it's really come through is what I'm doing right now. I decided I'd prefer to be a trial lawyer, and so that's what I do right now, and I like it. So like you'll go to court, you run trials, you'll bring on witnesses, you stand up and say I object, and it's super fun.
It's
Um, but
like
the
TV.
aspect exactly. I'm putting the courtroom on trial. But what I've noticed is that having this framing of someone who writes stories, it really helps present the trial because when it comes down to it, your case that you're presenting to a jury, a jury of 12 non-lawyers, right? They're just people from society. You can't just talk legalese. You need to talk to them in a way that a non-specialist would understand. And the way to do that is you tell a story. You have your theme. You oftentimes reduce your theme to like a single sentence. And that's what all the rest of the evidence points back to. So that part is really important. And another part is the sort of nitty gritty nuts and bolts, like the individual questions you ask. It's very important when you're asking someone questions as a lawyer, whether they're a friendly witness or an unfriendly witness, to know where you're going with it, right? You need to ask your questions purposefully. If they're a hostile witness, you need to try to hem them in so like their only response is a yes or no. But if they're a friendly witness and they're good, it's like, tell us about this, and then they go off. So you need to know how all that works. and you need to keep that all within the theme of the trial. So all of that, there's a lot of overlap with the writing aspect.
And this is why you're a plotter and not a pantser.
Exactly. I can't run a trial just by the seat of my pants.
Exactly.
I need to outline the trial, so I may as well outline my stories too.
Yeah, I can see how there's a direct parallel because you've got to bring the jury to the conclusion that you are trying to bring them to.
Mm-hmm.
And that takes a compelling story. Well, with your book, we did something that we don't always do, which is we decided that it was okay to have a sibling team work on the design. So people may or may not know this, but your brother is our illustrator, designer for the cover and some really cool, like I would say, spot illustrations. Mm-hmm. So, what are the benefits of working creatively with your brother?
It worked out really well because my brother designs book covers professionally, right? So that's sort of his job. So that was a natural thing that worked out really well. And we've been, collaborating on stuff for a long time, right? I told you about those Advent letters I've been writing. Well, he's illustrated a lot of those. Also, we gravitate toward a lot of the same interests. So I think that gives us a lot of the same sensibility. When he's designing the illustrations for inside the book, I felt like he already had a really good intuitive grasp on the things I wanted to show. He gets it. I think it's because we spent so much of our childhood reading the same dinosaur books that it all sort of flows together a lot more naturally.
Speaking of, though, working with your brother, I know you've done some podcasting together. So can you give us a quick pitch for your podcast?
Yes, I do have a podcast, and my brother Brian has been a guest on it. I usually bring him on to talk about Bigfoot and Godzilla, which, yeah, that's very fitting. But my podcast talks about a whole bunch of other stuff. It's called Believe to See. It's a podcast of the Anselm Society, which is an organization here in Colorado Springs dedicated. It's a very simple goal, a renaissance of the Christian imagination. So what our podcast does within that is we explore the relationship between faith, art, and storytelling. So what we like to say is we help folks connect the great stories in our own story to help folks better understand what it means to live with the Christian imagination. So in addition to the podcast, because I try to be a multimedia author, I also have a YouTube channel. It's something that me and my brother Brian run together. It's called Brothers Mellema. And we do several different things. One of them is we look at just sort of fun kind of mystery monsters, right? Cryptids. And as it happily happens, I'm kind of skeptical about most cryptids, but my brother Brian accepts everything, right? So we have natural disagreement there, and it's all very friendly, right? We don't, we're brothers. We just sort of banter back and forth, but it's all in good fun. So we'll have an episode on like whether some Texas cowboys actually shot a thunderbird back in the 1800s. Spoiler alert, I don't think so, but Brian made a pitch for it. Whether Marco Polo discovered dinosaurs in China, when he was doing his discovery. So it's just sort of fun stuff like that. Other stuff we do is we look at stuff from the ancient world, ancient cultures. So we do a lot of stuff on, the secrets of effective elephant warfare, which I've been very much looking forward to. And the newest series that we have is related to my book. My book is set as a frame story where a fictional version of me finds this manuscript, and that manuscript becomes the book. So my new series, it's kind of a vlog where fictional me tells the story of how he found the manuscript. That is just going. So if you want to hop on the train now, we're getting going with that. It's been super fun so far. I'm really looking forward to it. Again, that is Brothers Mellema.
Yeah, I've enjoyed, and you and your brother disagree so nicely with each other. It's amazing. I'm like, I love the fact that they're just like, no, you're wrong.
It's part of having a sibling, right? You disagree, but you're not actually mad. You're just
yeah. No one's mad. They're just like, no, you're wrong.
Yes. So. Neither of us have convinced the other on anything yet, but we're both still trying.
That's great. All right, Matt. So before we go, you've pitched your podcast and you pitched your YouTube channel. Now it's time to pitch your book.
Yeah, exactly. So, the name of the book is Red Rex, and it takes place, for you history buffs out there, it takes place after the Third Punic War. Okay. Again, that was one of my weird interests growing up. But it takes place on this hidden island called Cosmosa, where dinosaurs still exist and humans live alongside of them and have them as pets and ride them into battle. But in that world, there's a orphan boy named Carthus, and he is sadly a mere Stegosaurus herder at the beginning. He knows that his only chance at escaping this dreary life is to go to Koganri, which is the great school of dinosaur riding in the big city. So eventually, as you can probably guess, he does get to Koganri, but once he gets there, he realizes, and this is the dun dun dun, is the true adventures and problems are only just beginning. So yeah, a lot of this has to do with, trying to figure out what it would be like if there was an ancient civilization that actually had dinosaurs. Which ones would you ride on? Which ones would be your pets? Which ones would you eat? So that has been a ton of fun. If you want to pre-order it, obviously you can pre-order it on the Bandersnatch website. You can also do it on my website, MatthewMellema.com. And that's where you can find all this other stuff I've been talking about too. The Advent letters, YouTube, podcast, it's all
Awesome.
there.
Yeah, I think people are going to love this. We've had a lot of requests for middle grade along these lines, and I think this is going to really
Okay.
fill that niche for people. All right, Matt, I have some popcorn questions for you.
Yes.
What's your favorite dinosaur?
When I was a kid, favorite dinosaur was the Stegosaurus. Now there's a couple other contenders. I like the Tyrannosaurus Rex, the Utah Raptor, the Spinosaurus, and not technically a dinosaur, but I really love the Quetzalcoatlus.
All right, what's your favorite cryptid?
Oh, that's a really tough one. When I was a kid, I really liked the Loch Ness Monster. He was the first one that really got my attention. When I was in college, I was doing a study abroad in Great Britain, and I talked some of my friends to make a trip out to Loch Ness, which is absolutely gorgeous, and I loved it. I love Bigfoot. He's a classic. Whenever I'm out in the mountains here in Colorado, it's Bigfoot country here, so I do my Bigfoot calls, teaching my kids how to do Bigfoot calls. Oh, let's see some other ones. Chupacabra is very interesting. It's kind of weird, but I like it. The Yeti is a good one. How about Champ from Lake Champlain here in Vermont. That's just a classic American cryptid. Uh, I could go on, but those are the big ones.
Okay, so your book is a middle
Yes.
grade book. What word of wisdom would you have for
Mhm.
middle graders?
For middle graders, I would say a couple things. First off, don't be afraid to push yourselves with the things that you read, right? Something I tried to do in my book is I want middle graders to feel like I'm kind of pushing them a little bit, right? So in some of the word choices, the themes, all that, to feel like they're kind of a bridge from, some of the younger kid chapter books to the sort of books they'll be reading on. So don't be afraid to be pushed like that. I think it's good for you. And also, don't be afraid to just keep pursuing your interests. When you're in middle school and on through high school, you're very obsessed with what everybody thinks of you, and that's a normal way to feel. But guess what? People aren't thinking about you nearly as much as you think they are. So instead of worrying about what they think, just do what you like. So if you like dinosaurs, if you like Japanese samurai films, if you like studying the Punic Wars, just go for it, and don't be afraid to pursue the things that actually interest you.
All right, thank you. And then finally, last popcorn question. What are you reading right now?
Oh, right now, I really love reading detective fiction. So what I try to do, because I try to be a disciplined author. I try to have several books going at once. So I'll have like a literary fiction, I'll have like some nonfiction stuff, some like books on history or something like that. And then I usually try to read another middle grade book so just I can keep up with the market. But the ones I do for fun are detective fiction books. So that's like my reward at the end of the day if I've been a good writer. Good. So right now I'm reading a book. One of my things is I really love detective fiction for, among other reasons, it can be a great insight into a culture you're not familiar with. Because in order to solve a case, you have to interview a lot of people, And that means figuring out what the daily lives of a lot of ordinary people are. So that's a great way to learn about a culture, right? So I like reading books, detective books that take place in like Sweden. There's some really great Japanese ones. The one I'm reading right now takes place in Nigeria. So it's super interesting. I can't recommend it yet because I haven't finished it yet, but it's really good and interesting so far. So yes, my fun reading will always be a detective novel.
Oh, I like that. Yeah. Miss Marple, is the queen of observing people's lives and putting that together to help solve the mystery and being able to apply across different like scenarios or whatever. Well, I knew somebody who was like this here, and it reminds me of so and so, and of course that means they're the murderer.
Exactly. Honestly, I think Miss Marple is just about my favorite detective. I love her.
Yeah.
And I love how, in addition to her observation and her being able to draw on life experience, like you said, the main thing she has going for her is that nobody takes her seriously. And she uses that against the criminals.
Yes.
I love it.
Yes. Yes. This probably won't make the podcast because it's too much information, but that's actually the thing about Poirot as well. It's a stated fact that both Poirot and Miss Marple were not taken seriously, and that allowed them to be more of a detective than perhaps they would have gotten away with otherwise. And for Poirot, it's because he was Belgian, and the Belgians at that point in time were like basically war refugees, and so they were looked at like in a sort of negative way, like, and plus he was a little guy and he was kind of unassuming.
Yeah,
and
he has his
OCD
pompous
about things.
mustaches. So yeah, no,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. Well, Matt, thank you. Now, speaking of books, we do have submissions, and that window closes. It closes July 31st, which is tomorrow. So if you have a submission for us, go ahead and get that in so we can see it. All right. Thank you for being with us today, Matt. And may you find bookish treasures in your wanderings off the beaten path.
Thanks for listening in to our conversation today on the Banderpod. We hope you'll check out our full catalog at bandersnatchbooks.com. The Banderpod is produced by Rachel S. Donahue, A.B. Donahue, and Carolyn Claire Gibbons. Audio engineering by S.D.G. Morgan. Artwork by Evelyn Warnamundi. Many thanks to our friend Chris Slayton of Son of Laughter for our theme song, Cricket in a Jar. Find links and more in the show notes.